Alright, I've been meaning to do this video ever since the Xbox Scorpio or Xbox One X was announced. And here it is. And what type of video does this happen to be? Well, I made those videos in the Xbox One Scorpio saying we'll not do 4K ultra settings 60 frames per second, like many were claiming at the time. And probably won't, because at this point, there's been a lot of proof saying that it won't even be true 4K in many different ways, and it will be dynamic or checkerboarded. So in many ways, those videos were right. I was right. That's really weird. But there are a lot of people still saying, but Xbox. Even to the point to where a lot of them are saying stupid things like console optimization will make it do 4K 60 frames per second ultra because it's a console. You can tell these people have never experienced any type of hardware in their entire life. Here are my specs. An FX 6300 6-core 6-thread CPU at 3.5 GHz, a MSI RX 580 4GB because it was cheaper. Well, at the time, RX 580 and many AMD cards are skyrocketing in price because of Ethereum mining, which is basically like Bitcoins. And because of it, GPU mid-range cards are really expensive now, because there's no in between as of now. It's either you can get a GTX 1050 Ti for around $140, or a GTX 1080 for $500, or a 1060, which would be similar to mine. But as of now, that's around $300 and is way overpriced for the card. But don't worry, Ethereum mining focused cards are being made, and when those come out, these cards will be back to normal in price. The main difference being the amount of RAM I have compared to the Xbox One X. I have 8 GB, the Xbox One X has 12. But as of now, 8 is all you need. I have a 725 watt power supply, which is perfect for overclocking if you want to later on with this card, because you can make it into an FX 9590 by just overclocking, which, if you do not know, is on par with an R5 1400. But as of now, the FX 9590 is $140, and at max I've seen $190, which is great for the CPU, because if you have this motherboard that is compatible with AM3+, the upgrade path is there. It's shallow, but it is there. Probably the CPU is the one thing I cheaped out on in this build, but it is better than the Potato Masher's i5 760. I really feel like the FX 6300 is like the new budget CPU. It's perfect for its price. You can get around $70 and it outputs amazing performance for what you get. And it is certainly better than the Jaguar CPU found in the Xbox and PlayStation consoles. I just have a regular 1TB hard drive and non-SSD one. But I think that just about clears all the things you need to know about this build. Now, let's get on with the benchmarks. By the way, I'm sorry, at the top left corner you see the AMD relive thing. I'm sorry, that's just what happens when it records, and I don't want to use OBS because that takes too much performance, as in it makes more of an impact in gaming. So to make things more accurate, I'm just going to use my phone and take screenshots along with the gameplay, because I still have to show off how smooth the gameplay is or not. But first off is BioShock Remastered. This game, you can easily run this game at 4K, you know. I'm probably sure I can run this game at 8K if I were able to. Here, I'm going to show it off of this right now. Do you see that? Do you see that frame rate? That is at 4K max settings. I don't need anti-aliasing because it is 4K on a 1080p monitor. In fact, I'm going to look for some mods that make the game look even better, because I want this game to look as best as it could be. I know for The Witcher, there are mods that make the game even look better. But unfortunately, The Witcher is not the next game we're going to. Well, why did I bring it up exactly? Well, I have no idea. I just want to bring in The Witcher because it's my favorite game. The first game tested is Shadow of Mordor, and at 1080p very high settings, this game is amazing. And it also runs very well at 1440p. At 1080p most of the time, the frame rate was well over 60, and it was very stable. It was a very enjoyable experience and very playable. At 1440p, the frame rate was around 60, but did spike at around 70. Still very playable. But when we did get to 4K, we did have to drop some settings. Even dropping towards medium, but it would still be around the mid-50s. For many, this is completely playable, but for me, my minimum is 60, but I'm not gonna, punish it too hard. But one thing to know is Shadow of War is going to be one of the games coming at native 60 frames a second on the Xbox One X, which probably means that it will be on low settings. Well, I'm not so sure about the 60 frames a second thing. I'd rather have 1440p 60 very high settings than 4K low. But all around, this build does perform very well. Now, let's move on to the next game I benchmarked. Now on to Metro Last Light, one of my favorite games. At max settings, this game can be very demanding, and I really understand that. I mean, just look at it. Metro Last Light Redux is probably one of the best looking games ever made. Just look at a few of these screenshots. At 1080p, of course this game is playable. It's playable at 1080p 60 frames per second on console. But on this PC, we got way over that on the maximum settings. Well, maybe a little bit of compromises, I don't remember, but we got huge frame rates, seemingly as high as the mid-80s. After cranking it up to 1440p, we got a solid 60 frames per second on most things, with occasional drops into the low 50s. With this PC build, you can easily do 1440p in most games. It's basically a 1440p build. And at that point, you don't really need much anti-aliasing. If you have a 1080p monitor, that is. But now the part everyone here came for. Will it do 4K? Well, if we keep these settings and bring up 4K, the game will really start to stutter, as in this should not handle 4K higher settings. We would have to drop down the settings and turn things like tessellation all the way off and some other things all the way off, but then we would achieve a stable 60 frames a second or a little higher in 4K, but it would occasionally stutter and did not feel smooth. Personally, I would highly recommend picking this game up out of most of the ones in this. This happens to be one of my favorite games. Now here comes the home stretch when it comes to PC games. Arkham Origins may not be the best Arkham game, but I played it, and I got it for $5 on a Steam sale, and really at that price, you can't beat it. But anyways, we're here to benchmark it. At 1080p and 1440p with settings, the problem is the setting selection in this game is really weird. The main things you have to choose from are anti-aliasing, the DX11 or DX10, and other things similar to that. No texture things. And there was over 10 anti-aliasing options. But in 1080p and 1440p, you get a frame rate well above 60 frames a second, unless when you're playing in 1440p and you go into the streets where all the frame rates drop. The lowest one I saw was around the mid-50s. In 4K, there aren't many options to adjust the settings, so that makes it less playable. The frame rate stuttered and hovered around the mid-40s, but the game did look beautiful. Here's a screenshot at 1440p, and here's one at 4K. I would not recommend this game at 4K. For some unknown reason, Metal Gear Solid 5 does not seem to run well. That's probably because Ground Zeroes happens to be a demo you have to pay for, which in my opinion isn't that good. If they really wanted to get people hooked into Metal Gear Solid, they should have at least made it free or 99 cents. Oh, and by the way, that's my dog. You hear that in the background? The best settings you can really use is 1080p high, because the frame rate is capped at 60 frames a second, and any higher resolution will make the frame rate drop. And if you go to very high settings, you're still pretty much dead in the water. With a game this graphically demanding, you're probably going to need a better graphics card if you want to do anything above 1080p. Probably a GTX 1070.
We're leaving hot zone. Returning to base. Confirmed. The target is safe.
What took you so long?
The 2010 game Aliens vs. Predator performed very well at 4K. I think the performance dropped a little because I was recording, but it seemed to achieve 60 frames a second most of the time. There's not much to be said here because this game is 7 years old and looks still beautiful, but you know, it's still good to know that you can do this game at full 4K native. And if you're having trouble, just knock down the resolution one. You probably won't be able to tell much of a difference. Spec Ops Online ran really well, especially since it was a 5-year-old game. It probably should. When I got into the game, it automatically locked onto 4K and very high settings, and it was not able to do a stable 60 frames per second. drop it down to 1440p, and it was well above 60 frames. At very high settings of 1440p, I was getting around 70 to 101 frames a second. And if you want to have a stable and locked frame rate, just turn on VSync. But if you're running anything above 60 Hz, just drop down the settings and you'll be perfect. You'll get well over 60 frames a second and maybe well over 100. I didn't test 1080p, but I imagine you'd be a lot better. As in, back when I had my GTX 950, I was getting fantastic frame rates well above 60 at 1080p very high settings as well. Another thing to mention real quick is I had Dead Island Riptide Remastered downloaded on my PC, but I was benchmarking it and I do not have the game installed currently. But at 1440p highest settings, I was getting a stable 60 frames per second in the city. At 1080p, I was getting 120 frames, which is very fantastic. The only frame rate drops that were visible was when there were explosions or a huge amount of zombies closing in. I'm talking well over a dozen, so you'll be fine. Now, onto the final game, probably the most requested game to benchmark. Here it is, The Witcher 3 benchmarks. At 1080p Ultra, you get a very smooth 60 frames per second when out in the wilderness, and slows down occasionally when you're in the forest with a bunch of trees. I did not test out in the huge dense cities because at the moment I wasn't near one. At 1440p, the settings would have needed to be dropped down to a mix of medium and high, and I would get a stable-ish 53 frames a second. That's pretty good and is a lot better than what's available on console currently, and will probably be a lot better than what's available on the Xbox One X, because The Witcher 3 is still an incredibly hard game to run even 2 years later. I had attempted to do 4K, but even at the very low settings, it still was not an option. It was a very, very stuttery and inconsistent 36 frames a second, and it was just awful looking compared to Ultra. In my opinion, the only foreseeable way to get a stable 60 frames per second at 4K is a 1080 Ti, and that graphics card costs $700. That is a lot more than my PC and the Xbox One Scorpio. And the Xbox brand uses AMD hardware, like its GPU and CPU, and at the moment AMD has not released anything even comparable to GTX 1080 Ti. The only two things are Vega Frontier Edition, and that is not even made for gaming, it's made for professional tasks, similar to a Quadro, or an R9 2895X2, which is an extremely warm and power-hungry card. But that would explain why the Xbox One X is very power-hungry and needs water cooling. Well, I'm not sure about the water cooling part, but it's probably very power hungry if it needs water cooling. Oh, by the way, can't wait for the water cooling to leak. But now here's the main conclusion. There's no way at $499 that the Xbox One Scorpio will outperform many PCs that are out today. In fact, judging by the specs and the amount of speed in the GPU and the CPU, it's impossible. And it's no wonder why games like Assassin's Creed Origins and Anthem are using dynamic resolution. They're touting it as true 4K because, hey, if you look at the sky for a little bit and have nothing going on, maybe you're aiming and really looking at it for a few seconds, it looks like 4K. But while you're actually fighting, it will be 900p. Probably 1080p at best. You know, when you're shooting at things from a far distance in a barren area. And they damn well know this. The only reason why Microsoft employees are touting that this will be true 4K is because their jobs depend on this. Don't you understand? They're saying it because they want to make money. And if they lie saying this will be great, 4K ultra setting 60 frames per second on all of our games, it's going to sell more games. And with 4K, why do you think they showed off a lot of games that are easily ran? Like Super Lucky's Tale, Ashen. Sea of Thieves is cell shaded, so that'll be pretty easy to run. And Forza 6, if it weren't for the Windows Store being under trash, I'd probably be able to run it at 4K, because racing games aren't the most demanding out there. And is 4K really worth it? Well, in my opinion, in older games, yes. Like, take a look at this screenshot from Spec Ops: The Line right here. This screenshot is now my background on my PC. It looks so good. It looks like The Division. Well, maybe not, but look. This game is amazing, and instead of coming out in 2013, it looks like it came out in 2014. It makes almost every single game you can run a lot better, but the problem is, the price for performance for it right now is not the greatest. Microsoft really should not have been focusing on 4K. Hell, I think the most they should have pushed was 1920 by 1200, slightly over 1080p. Yes, and I know the GPU landscape right now on PC is very shaky, but you can still get a lot of good deals for the used market. In fact, I'll pull up a few used GPUs right now on eBay. Like earlier, I saw an R9 280X for 80 bucks. That's a steal, and it's a lot better than any console as of now, including the PS4 Pro. In fact, on Newegg, you can get 1050 Ti's for around $150, and that will run circles around the PlayStation 4 Pro. But if you're looking to get a GTX 1060 or 70, don't even bother. Just jump to the 1080, because at this point, the mid-range cards are priced weirdly. In fact, they went from about $200 to being around, what, the 1070 is $700. At that point, you get GTX 1080 for cheaper. And with that, you were close to 4K Ultra Gaming. You can get 1440p Ultra Gaming at plus 60 FPS. That is amazing. But if a GTX 1080 is not in your budget right now, then just wait until the Ethereum mining cards come out or new GPU lines come out, because then prices will really drop. Or if you really want to save money, just buy used. Just remember to shop smartly and make sure the seller is trusted, because you don't want to get scammed. And if a deal is too good to be true, it's likely not. But to make it short, if you want to make an entry-level PC for 1080p gaming, the time is now. If you want to get something mid-range, well, the time is not now. If you want to get something high-end, you can get a GTX 1080 for 500 bucks, so the time is now for that. But the best part about it, if you decide to wait, probably around until the Xbox One X release, you know, to build a better PC, and GPU prices will drop again, because Ethereum mining is a craze right now, and the craze is eventually end, unless you're TF2 or Counter-Strike. That's a joke, and it's not really good, but anyway. Let's say you're planning to build a PC with $350 now, and over the next few months you save up $200. You can build an amazing PC with that. And if you play your cards right, you can get one that blows mine out of the water. Anyways, if you want me to do a follow-up to this later on, you know, comparing more games, let me know. But for now, that'll be it. Remember to like and subscribe. Have a nice day.